The rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and official, bearing the seal of the Air Force Academy. Captain Sarah Chun had been expecting it, but the words still cut deeper than anticipated. Unfortunately, we cannot recommend you for advanced flight training at this time. Your qualifications, while impressive, do not align with current operational requirements for combat aviation roles. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah crumpled the letter slowly, her fingers trembling not with sadness, but with a quiet fury that had been building for 3 years. She stood in the cramped office of Henderson Municipal Airport, surrounded by flight manuals for crop dusters and weekend recreational aircraft, watching her dreams dissolve into bureaucratic language that meant one thing: she was a woman, and women didn't fly combat missions. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could outfly most of the men who'd been accepted into the program she'd been denied. Sarah had logged more flight hours than pilots twice her age, mastered aircraft that intimidated seasoned aviators, and demonstrated precision that made veteran instructors shake their heads in amazement. But none of that mattered when policy and prejudice intersected at 30,000 feet. Henderson Municipal Airport sat on the edge of the Mojave Desert, a place where dreams came to die or be reborn, depending on your perspective. Sarah had chosen this remote outpost deliberately after her military application was rejected, seeking solitude and the kind of flying that didn't require approval from committees who'd never felt the rush of pulling G's in a steep climb or the delicate touch needed to land in crosswinds that would ground lesser pilots. The airport served crop dusters, charter flights for wealthy ranchers, and the occasional emergency medical transport when the local hospital needed to move critical patients to larger facilities in Los Angeles or Phoenix. It was honest work, Sarah told herself, but it felt like using a Formula One race car to deliver groceries. Every day she flew aircraft that represented a fraction of her capabilities, following flight plans that challenged her about as much as a Sunday drive challenged a NASCAR driver. Frank Morrison, the airport's owner and chief mechanic, had hired Sarah without hesitation 2 years ago. He was a former Navy pilot who'd recognized something in her approach to flying that transcended gender or politics. Frank had watched her handle a twin-engine Beechcraft in conditions that would have sent other pilots running for cover, and he'd seen enough aviation talent to know the real thing when it appeared. "You're wasting away out here," Frank said as Sarah filed her flight report after a routine cargo run to Barstow. His weathered hands were covered in engine grease, and his eyes held the kind of concern that came from watching someone slowly surrender their potential. "When's the last time you pushed yourself? Really pushed yourself?" Sarah shrugged, hanging up her headset with more force than necessary. "Last Tuesday. Had to deal with some interesting turbulence over the pass." Frank snorted with derision. "Turbulence? Sarah, I've seen you fly approaches that would make test pilots nervous, and you're talking to me about turbulence like it's some kind of challenge." The truth was more complicated than Frank realized. Sarah had been pushing herself, but only in ways that wouldn't attract attention or raise questions about her capabilities. She flew at night sometimes, taking up the airport's old Cessna and practicing maneuvers that had nothing to do with civilian aviation. Steep turns that civilian aircraft weren't designed for, navigation challenges that tested her instrument skills beyond normal requirements, precision flying that belonged in military training rather than recreational aviation. She'd learned to fly alone, not just because she preferred solitude, but because witnesses might wonder why a crop duster pilot was practicing combat maneuvers over the desert. Sarah had accepted that her skills would remain largely unused, that she'd spend her career flying straight lines between predictable destinations, following air traffic control instructions that never tested her limits or challenged her abilities. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Frank answered with his usual gruff efficiency, but his expression changed quickly from routine business to intense focus. "When?" he asked, grabbing a pen and scribbling notes. "How many?" "Roger that, we'll have someone in the air in 20 minutes. He hung up and turned to Sarah with an expression she'd never seen before. "Emergency call from Edwards Air Force Base. They've got a situation developing in the mountains. Search and rescue operation, and they need civilian aircraft to assist. Their helicopters are grounded due to equipment failures, and they're running out of daylight." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a quickening that had nothing to do with routine cargo flights or predictable destinations. What kind of situation? Training exercise went wrong. Two-man crew and their experimental aircraft went down somewhere in the San Gabriel Mountains. Terrain's too rough for ground teams, weather's deteriorating, and they need someone who can navigate tight spaces and challenging conditions. Frank looked at her directly. "Sarah, this is the kind of flying you were born for." The San Gabriel Mountains presented challenges that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. Narrow canyons, unpredictable wind patterns, terrain that offered few landing options, and weather that could change from clear skies to dangerous conditions within minutes. It was exactly the kind of environment that had attracted Sarah to flying. In the first place, the kind of challenge that made her feel truly alive. "What aircraft are we talking about?" she asked, already moving toward the hangar where their most capable aircraft waited. "The Bell 206. It's not military grade, but it's the most maneuverable thing we've got." Frank paused, studying her face. "Sarah, you should know that Edwards specifically requested our most experienced pilot. They didn't ask for credentials or certifications. They asked for someone who could handle the impossible." The Bell 206 helicopter sat in the hangar like a caged predator, its sleek lines and powerful engine representing capabilities that Sarah had dreamed of utilizing for years. She'd logged hundreds of hours in similar aircraft during her failed attempt to qualify for military service, but those had been training flights under controlled conditions. This would be real-world application of skills that had been gathering dust for too long. As she began her pre-flight inspection, Sarah felt muscle memory awakening. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking systems and controls with the kind of precision that came from countless hours of training. Helicopter responded to her touch like an extension of her own body, eager and ready for the kind of mission it was designed to perform. "Edwards Control. This is Henderson Municipal, Calcine Desert Fox. Requesting coordinates and situation update," Sarah transmitted as she lifted off into the late afternoon sky. The helicopter rose smoothly, its powerful rotors cutting through air that seemed to welcome her return to serious flying. "Desert Fox, this is Edwards Search and Rescue Control. Downed aircraft last known position is grid reference 34, 3428 north, 117, 6469 west, approximately 15 miles northeast of your current position. Terrain is extremely challenging and weather window is closing rapidly. Be advised our military aircraft are unable to access the area due to equipment limitations." Sarah acknowledged the transmission while studying the topographical features. Ahead, the San Gabriel Mountains rose like a fortress of granite and pine, their peaks shrouded in clouds that suggested deteriorating weather conditions. The coordinates placed the downed aircraft in an area that would challenge even experienced mountain pilots, a maze of narrow canyons and steep ridges that offered few safe approaches. But as she flew toward the search area, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not just confidence, but a sense of rightness, as if she was finally using skills that had been dormant too long. The helicopter responded to her inputs with precision, navigating updrafts and crosswinds with the kind of finesse that turned flying from transportation into art. "Edwards Control, Desert Fox approaching search grid. Beginning systematic visual. Reconnaissance of the area." Sarah banked the helicopter into a search pattern that maximized visibility while maintaining safe distance from the treacherous terrain below. Her eyes scanned the landscape with trained intensity, looking for any sign of the missing aircraft. The downed plane wasn't immediately visible, which meant it had likely crashed in one of the deeper canyons or behind ridgelines that concealed it from aerial observation. Sarah began a methodical search pattern, flying closer to the terrain than most civilian pilots would consider safe, using her military training to extract maximum effectiveness from every minute of available daylight. 20 minutes into the search, she spotted something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. A glint of metal reflecting the fading sunlight, partially concealed by pine trees in a canyon that looked impossibly narrow for aircraft access. Edwards Control. Desert Fox has possible visual contact with downed aircraft. Investigating further. The canyon was tight, barely wide enough for her helicopter's rotor span, with walls that rose vertically on both sides. Sarah studied the approach carefully, calculating wind patterns and identifying potential escape routes if conditions deteriorated. It was the kind of flying that required absolute precision, where the margin for error was measured in inches rather than feet. Desert Fox. Be advised that canyon approach appears extremely hazardous. Recommend maintaining safe distance until ground teams can access the area. Came the voice from Edwards Control, professional concern evident in the call. Transmission. Sarah smiled grimly. They were telling her to back off because they assumed she lacked the skills to handle challenging terrain. It was the same assumption that had led to her rejection from military flight training, the belief that she couldn't handle the dangerous situations that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. Edwards Control, understand your concern. Beginning approach to downed aircraft location. Will maintain constant communication. Sarah lowered the collective and began her descent into the canyon, her movements precise and controlled. The helicopter responded like a finely tuned instrument, settling toward the narrow space with mechanical precision. The downed aircraft was indeed there, a small experimental plane that had apparently suffered engine failure and managed a forced landing in the only clear space available. The pilots were visible, waving frantically at her approach, clearly alive but potentially injured and definitely stranded in terrain that ground rescue teams couldn't access before dark. But the approach was everything Sarah had expected, and more. The canyon walls created turbulent air currents that buffeted the helicopter unpredictably. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The landing zone was barely large enough for her aircraft, surrounded by trees and boulders that left no room for error. It was exactly the kind of situation that civilian pilots were trained to avoid and military pilots were trained to master. Sarah set the helicopter down with a touch so gentle that the skids barely disturbed the pine needles beneath them. She'd managed to place the aircraft in a space that looked impossible from a distance, using skills that had been dormant for too long and judgment that belonged in textbooks about precision flying. Edwards Control. Desert Fox is on the ground with survivors. Beginning evacuation procedures, she transmitted. Already shutting down non-essential systems and preparing for a quick departure. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and she could see storm clouds building over the ridgelines that would make departure even more challenging than arrival had been. The two pilots approached her helicopter with obvious relief and amazement. Both were young Air Force officers, clearly shaken by their ordeal but mobile and alert. "Ma'am," said the senior officer, a lieutenant with the kind of respectful tone reserved for someone who just performed the impossible, "we didn't think anyone could land in this canyon. That was incredible flying." Sarah helped them aboard quickly, securing their safety restraints and conducting a rapid medical assessment. Both appeared to have minor injuries, nothing that required immediate medical attention, but they needed evacuation to proper facilities for thorough examination. More importantly, they needed to be extracted before weather conditions made departure impossible. Gentlemen, we're going to depart immediately. The weather window is closing, and this canyon becomes extremely dangerous when visibility drops. Sarah started the engine and began her departure checklist, her movements efficient and professional. The helicopter responded immediately, eager to return to safer airspace. The departure was even more challenging than the approach had been. Storm clouds had moved in, reducing visibility and creating wind patterns that turned the narrow canyon into a corridor of turbulent air. Sarah climbed carefully, reading the aircraft's responses and adjusting for conditions that changed by the congo. Second, Desert Fox, Edwards Control, were showing deteriorating weather in your area. What's your status? The concern in the controller's voice was unmistakable. They were monitoring conditions that would have grounded most aircraft and challenged even experienced military pilots. Edwards Control, Desert Fox departing the canyon with 2 survivors aboard. Conditions are challenging but manageable. Estimate: 10 minutes to clear terrain and return to safe airspace. Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the complexity of the flying she was performing. She guided the helicopter up through the canyon, navigating between rock walls that seemed to close in as storm clouds reduced visibility to mere yards. It was flying that required absolute trust in instruments, combined with visual references that appeared and disappeared in shifting weather. Sarah found herself relying on skills she developed during military training, techniques for flying in conditions that civilian aviation avoided entirely. When they finally cleared the canyon and emerged into relatively open airspace, Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with routine accomplishment. She just completed a rescue mission that would have challenged military pilots, using skills that had been dormant for years and judgment that belonged in advanced tactical aviation. Edwards Control, Desert Fox clear of terrain with survivors aboard. Requesting medical evaluation and debrief at your earliest convenience, she transmitted, already beginning her approach to Edwards Air Force Base, the most difficult part of the mission was complete, but she suspected that the real consequences were just beginning. Desert Fox, you're cleared for immediate landing at Edwards. Emergency medical team standing by. Also be advised that Colonel Patricia Barnes requests to speak with you upon landing. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while considering the implications. A colonel wanting to debrief a civilian pilot suggested that her performance had attracted attention from people who understood the difficulty of what she'd just accomplished. Edwards Air Force Base sprawled across the desert like a monument to aviation achievement, home to test pilots and experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the sky. As Sarah landed at the designated area, she could see emergency medical personnel waiting to evaluate the rescued pilots, but she also noticed several officers whose bearings suggested they were interested in more than just the medical condition of the survivors. After shutting down the helicopter and completing her post-flight checklist, Sarah was approached by a woman whose uniform bore the eagles of a full colonel. Patricia Barnes moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, but her expression held genuine respect rather than military formality. "Captain Chun," Colonel Barnes said, extending her hand with a grip that suggested she was accustomed to dealing with aviators. "I understand you've just completed a rescue mission that our own aircraft couldn't attempt. I'd like to discuss your background and the flying you demonstrated today." Sarah shook the offered hand, immediately recognizing that this conversation would likely be more significant than routine post-mission debriefing. "Colonel, I was happy to assist. The conditions were challenging, but the mission was successful." "Challenging," Colonel Barnes repeated with what might have been amusement. "Captain, I've been flying for 22 years, including combat missions and test pilot duties. What you just accomplished in that canyon would have challenged our most experienced helicopter pilots. Where exactly did you learn to fly like that?" The question Sarah had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Her civilian employment at Henderson Municipal had been a way to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny, but exceptional performance had a way of attracting attention regardless of the circumstances. Military training colonel. I was rejected for advanced flight training 3 years ago, but I completed initial phases before the decision was made. Sarah kept her response factual and professional, but she could see that Colonel Barnes was processing information that didn't align with normal expectations. Rejected for advanced training, the colonel repeated slowly. Captain, I've reviewed the preliminary report from today's mission. The flying you demonstrated exceeds the capabilities we expect from advanced training graduates. Who exactly made the decision to reject your application? Sarah felt familiar frustration rising. The decision was made at the policy level, Colonel. My qualifications were deemed insufficient for combat aviation roles. She didn't mention that the insufficiency had nothing to do with flying ability and everything to do with gender restrictions that weren't officially acknowledged but were universally understood. Colonel Barnes studied her face with the intensity of someone trained to read between lines and recognize truth that wasn't explicitly stated. Captain, would you be interested in a conversation about opportunities that might be available for pilots with your demonstrated capabilities? We have programs that specifically seek exceptional aviators regardless of their previous application status. The offer hung in the air like a challenge that Sarah had been waiting years to receive. After spending 2 years flying cargo routes and crop dusting runs, the prospect of returning to the kind of aviation that truly tested her abilities was both thrilling and terrifying. But she'd learned to be cautious about military promises after her previous disappointment. What kind of opportunities, Colonel? Sarah asked carefully. Combat search and rescue. It's a new program, still in development, looking for pilots who can handle impossible situations and succeed where conventional approaches fail. Today's mission suggests you might be exactly what we've been searching for. Colonel Barnes paused, studying Sarah's reaction. The program is looking for its first female combat rescue pilot, someone who can prove that exceptional flying transcends traditional barriers. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that this conversation represented exactly the opportunity she'd been preparing for without realizing it. Combat search and rescue was the kind of flying that challenged every skill she possessed, the intersection of tactical aviation and humanitarian mission that gave meaning to technical capability. Colonel, I'm interested in learning more, she said, keeping her voice professional despite the excitement building inside her. What would the training involve? 6 months of intensive preparation. Combat flying, tactical rescue procedures, survival training, and integration with special operations teams. It's designed to be the most challenging aviation program in the military, with a failure rate that exceeds anything you've encountered. Colonel Barnes smiled slightly. Based on today's performance, I suspect you'll find it exactly what you've been looking for. As Sarah drove back to Henderson Municipal that evening, she found herself replaying the conversation with Colonel Barnes and considering implications that extended far beyond personal opportunity. Combat search and rescue represented a chance to use her skills in service of something larger than routine aviation, but it also meant stepping into a role that no woman had held before. The rejection letter that had arrived that morning felt like ancient history now, a document from a time when her capabilities were judged by policy rather than performance. Today had demonstrated that exceptional flying spoke louder than bureaucratic restrictions, that situations requiring impossible solutions didn't care about gender or politics. Frank was waiting when she returned to the airport, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. How'd it go out there? Heard on the radio that you pulled off something pretty impressive. The mission was successful, Sarah replied, beginning her post-flight paperwork with mechanical precision. Both pilots were extracted safely, no injuries beyond minor trauma. She paused, considering how much to share. "Frank, I've been offered an opportunity. Military training program that would mean leaving Henderson." Frank nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this conversation since the day he'd hired her. "Combat search and rescue?" When Sarah looked at him with surprise, he smiled. "Sarah, I may run a small desert airport, but I still have contacts in military aviation. Word travels fast when a civilian pilot accomplishes something that impresses Air Force colonels." "You think I should take it?" she asked, genuinely interested in his opinion. Frank had been flying longer than she'd been alive, and his judgment about aviation matters had proven consistently reliable. "I think you'd be crazy not to," he replied without hesitation. "You've been wasting your talents out here, flying missions that barely challenge a student pilot. Today you got a taste of what you're really capable of, and it reminded you why you wanted to fly in the first place." That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment overlooking the desert, staring at Colonel Barnes's business card and considering a decision that would reshape her entire future. The safe choice was to remain at Henderson Municipal, flying predictable routes and avoiding the kind of scrutiny that came with groundbreaking achievement. But safety had never been what drew her to aviation. She'd started flying because she loved the challenge of mastering something that seemed impossible, the satisfaction of controlling powerful machines with precision that required total concentration and absolute skill. Commercial aviation had provided security, but not fulfillment, steady employment, but not the kind of purpose that made her eager to wake up each morning. Combat search and rescue represented everything she'd been training for without realizing it. The opportunity to use her skills in service of missions that mattered, to face challenges that would test every capability she possessed, and to prove that exceptional flying wasn't determined by gender, but by preparation, judgment, and the courage to attempt what others considered impossible. The next morning, Sarah called Colonel Barnes and accepted the position. 6 months later, she would graduate as the first woman qualified for combat search and rescue operations, having proven that barriers existed to be overcome and that some achievements were worth the risks required to pursue them. But that morning, as she prepared to leave Henderson Municipal and embark on training that would challenge everything she thought she knew about flying, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her initial rejection from military aviation. Hope that her skills would finally be utilized to their full potential in service of something larger than herself. The desert airport that had sheltered her dreams for 2 years watched her departure with the kind of satisfaction that came from serving its purpose. Sometimes the most important destinations required stopping somewhere unexpected to prepare for journeys that hadn't seemed possible when the trip began. 6 months at Kirtland Air Force Base transformed Sarah Chun in ways she hadn't anticipated. The Combat Search and Rescue School occupied a sprawling complex in New Mexico, where the desert heat served as a constant reminder that comfort was a luxury warriors couldn't afford. Every morning began before dawn with physical conditioning that pushed students beyond their perceived limitations, followed by classroom instruction that compressed years of tactical knowledge into intensive sessions designed to forge decision-makers rather than mere pilots. Sarah found herself among 15 other candidates, all male, all carrying the confidence that came from successful military careers and advanced flight training. The initial dynamic was predictable. Polite professional courtesy mixed with barely concealed skepticism about whether a woman belonged in training designed to produce the military's most elite rescue pilots. She'd experienced similar attitudes during her initial flight training. But the stakes felt higher here, the scrutiny more intense. Major David Rodriguez served as the program's commanding officer, a veteran combat pilot whose reputation included successful missions in environments that challenged the most experienced aviators. His approach to training was methodical and unforgiving, designed to identify weaknesses before they became fatal flaws in real-world operations. During the first week, he made his expectations clear. Combat search and rescue isn't about flying. Major Rodriguez told the assembled candidates during their initial briefing. Anyone can learn to operate aircraft. This program is about making decisions when failure means death for people counting on you to bring them home. You'll be operating in hostile territory, under fire, in weather conditions that ground other aircraft, attempting missions that conventional wisdom says are impossible. The training curriculum reflected those realities. Students learned to fly multiple aircraft types in conditions that civilian aviation avoided entirely. Night operations in zero visibility, approaches to landing zones under simulated enemy, fire, precision flying that required placing aircraft in spaces barely large enough to accommodate them. But the technical aspects were just the foundation for more complex challenges. Sarah discovered that her rejection from conventional military aviation had inadvertently prepared her for this program in ways that her male colleagues' successful careers hadn't. She'd spent 2 years flying in difficult conditions at Henderson Municipal, making decisions without oversight, handling emergencies that tested her judgment and skill simultaneously, while her classmates were adapting from highly structured military aviation to the improvisation required for combat rescue. Sarah was simply applying abilities she'd been developing through necessity. The first major evaluation came during the 4th week of training. Students were required to plan and execute a simulated rescue mission in mountainous terrain, complicated by weather conditions and time constraints that eliminated margin for error. The scenario was designed to test decision-making under pressure, the ability to adapt when initial plans proved inadequate, and the kind of precise flying that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. Lieutenant James Morrison, a former Navy pilot with extensive carrier experience, approached the mission with methodical preparation and textbook execution. His plan was comprehensive, his briefing professional, his approach exactly what military doctrine recommended for complex rescue operations. But when simulated weather conditions deteriorated beyond his planning parameters, Morrison struggled to adapt quickly enough to maintain mission success. Captain Michael Torres, an Army helicopter pilot with combat experience in Afghanistan, demonstrated the aggressive decision-making that had served him well in previous deployments. His approach was bold, direct, and effective until unexpected. Terrain features forced him to modify his extraction plan under time pressure that left little room for extended deliberation. When Sarah's turn came, she found herself facing a scenario that felt familiar despite its artificial nature. The simulated downed aircrew was located in terrain that resembled the San Gabriel Mountains where she'd conducted her first real rescue mission. The weather parameters matched conditions she'd encountered during crop dusting operations, when sudden storms made routine flights dangerous. The time constraints were similar to medical evacuation flights she'd conducted when patients couldn't wait for ideal conditions. Sarah's approach differed from her classmates in subtle but significant ways. Where they relied on comprehensive planning and systematic execution, she demonstrated the kind of adaptive decision-making that came from years of flying alone, without backup or oversight. Her mission planning was efficient rather than exhaustive, focused on critical factors while maintaining flexibility for unexpected developments. The simulated rescue unfolded exactly as Major Rodriguez had designed it to challenge conventional approaches. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly, forcing students to choose between aborting the mission or accepting risks that exceeded normal safety parameters. The terrain proved more challenging than initial reconnaissance had suggested, requiring precision flying in confined spaces with minimal landing options. Sarah navigated these complications with a combination of technical skill and intuitive judgment that impressed even skeptical observers. She modified her approach in real time as conditions changed, demonstrated aircraft control that maximized performance in challenging conditions, and completed the extraction with efficiency that suggested she'd been conducting similar missions for years rather than weeks. Outstanding performance, Captain Chen, Major Rodriguez commented during her post-mission debrief. Your ability to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining mission focus was exceptional. How did you develop that level of comfort with improvisation? The question touched on something Sarah had been thinking about throughout her training. Her classmates were accomplished pilots with impressive credentials, but their success had come through following established procedures and meeting predetermined standards. Her path to this program had been different, marked by rejection and the necessity of proving herself repeatedly in situations where standards were secondary to results. Sir, civilian aviation taught me that conditions rarely match planning expectations, she replied carefully. Success depends on making good decisions with incomplete information rather than waiting for perfect solutions. The response was honest but incomplete. The complete answer would have included years of frustration, the development of skills that weren't formally recognized, and the kind of determination that came from having doors closed despite demonstrated capability. As training progressed, Sarah found herself becoming the unofficial standard against which other students measured their performance. Not because of formal rankings or instructor preferences, but because her approach to challenges consistently produced results that combined technical excellence with practical effectiveness. Her classmates began observing her methods, asking questions about techniques that seemed to exceed what formal instruction had provided. The transformation wasn't lost on the training staff. Colonel Patricia Barnes visited the program during the 8th week, ostensibly for routine evaluation, but clearly interested in Sarah's progress. Her conversation with Major Rodriguez was conducted privately, but Sarah noticed increased attention to her performance and more detailed documentation of her training results. The most significant test came during the 12th week of training. Students were required to conduct a live rescue mission, extracting military personnel from a simulated hostile environment while operating under conditions that approximated real combat situations. The exercise was conducted at night in mountainous terrain, with weather conditions that pushed aircraft and pilot capabilities to their limits. Sarah found herself paired with Captain Torres for a mission that required coordination between two aircraft and precise timing to succeed. The scenario involved extracting the 6-man special operations team from a location that could only be accessed through a narrow canyon, with departure routes that were complicated by simulated enemy activity and deteriorating weather conditions. The mission planning phase revealed different approaches to complex problems. Torres favored aggressive tactics that relied on speed and surprise to overcome environmental challenges. Sarah preferred adaptive strategies that maintained multiple options as conditions changed. Their discussion during preparation reflected broader philosophical differences about risk management and mission execution. We need to get in fast and get out faster, Torres argued during their planning session. The longer we spend in that canyon, the more likely we are to encounter problems we can't solve. His approach was based on combat experience where decisive action often meant survival, but it assumed that initial plans would remain viable throughout mission execution. Sarah studied the terrain maps and weather projections with different priorities. What happens if the weather deteriorates faster than predicted? What if the extraction point isn't accessible as planned? We need alternatives that don't require starting over. Her questions reflected lessons learned from flights where adaptation had been the difference between success and failure. The actual mission unfolded exactly as Sarah had anticipated. Initial approach conditions were acceptable, allowing Torres to begin his aggressive timeline, but weather conditions deteriorated rapidly once they were committed to the canyon approach. The extraction point that had appeared accessible during planning proved to be complicated by wind patterns that made precision hovering dangerous. Torres found himself struggling to maintain his timeline while adapting to conditions that his planning hadn't fully considered. His aircraft control remained excellent, But his decision-making showed the strain of trying to force predetermined solutions onto problems that required improvisation. Sarah, monitoring the situation from her supporting position, recognized the development of a potentially dangerous situation. Lead aircraft suggest we modify extraction sequence to account for current wind conditions. She transmitted, offering assistance without undermining Torres's command authority. I can provide cover while you adjust approach angle. The suggestion was professional and helpful, but it also demonstrated the kind of real-time problem-solving that distinguished exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. Torres accepted her recommendation, and together they modified their approach to account for conditions that neither had anticipated during planning. The extraction was completed successfully, but the mission had required exactly the kind of adaptive decision-making that Sarah had advocated during preparation. The experience reinforced her growing reputation as a pilot who could succeed when conventional approaches proved inadequate. Major Rodriguez's evaluation of the mission was thorough and illuminating. Both pilots demonstrated excellent technical skills and professional coordination, he noted during the debrief. However, Captain Chun's anticipation of potential complications and preparation of alternative solutions proved crucial when conditions deteriorated beyond planning parameters. The comment carried implications that extended beyond simple performance evaluation. Sarah was developing a reputation for success in situations that challenged other accomplished pilots, not because of superior aircraft control or technical knowledge, but because of judgment that seemed to anticipate problems before they became critical. As training entered its final phase, Sarah found herself facing a different kind of challenge. Her consistent performance had attracted attention from military officials whose interest extended beyond the combat search and rescue program. Representatives from various commands had begun making discreet inquiries about her background, her availability for special assignments, and her interest in roles that hadn't been clearly defined. The attention was flattering but also concerning. Sarah had joined the program to prove that she belonged in military aviation, not to become a symbol or representative of broader social change. She wanted to be recognized as an exceptional pilot who happened to be female, not as a female pilot whose achievements were noteworthy primarily because of her gender. Colonel Barnes addressed this concern during a private conversation in the final week of training. Captain Chun, your performance throughout this program has been exceptional by any standard. You've demonstrated capabilities that place you among the most qualified combat rescue pilots we've trained. However, you should understand that graduating from this program will make you the first woman qualified for these missions. That status will bring opportunities and challenges you haven't anticipated. The conversation forced Sarah to confront realities she'd been avoiding. Success in the program meant more than personal achievement or professional advancement. It meant stepping into a role that would be scrutinized, analyzed, and used as evidence in debates about women's capabilities in combat roles. Every mission she flew, every decision she made, every success or failure would be magnified beyond its individual significance. Colonel, I joined this program to be a rescue pilot, not a pioneer, Sarah replied honestly. I want my performance to be judged by the same standards applied to everyone else. The statement reflected her genuine desire to be evaluated as a pilot rather than as a representative of her gender, but it also revealed a certain naivety about the broader implications of her achievement. Captain, pioneers rarely choose their role, Colonel Barnes replied with understanding that came from her own experience breaking barriers in military aviation. But the choice you have now is whether to embrace the responsibility that comes with exceptional achievement or to limit yourself to avoid attention that makes you uncomfortable. The graduation ceremony for Combat Search and Rescue School was conducted with military precision and appropriate recognition of the accomplishment. It represented 14 pilots had successfully completed training that challenged their technical skills, physical capabilities, and mental resilience. Each graduate had demonstrated competence that qualified them for missions that other military aviators couldn't attempt. Sarah stood among her classmates as Major Rodriguez presented certificates and outlined the assignments that awaited each new combat rescue pilot. Her own orders were different from the others, more complex and carrying implications that extended beyond routine military duty. She was being assigned to a special operations unit that conducted missions in environments too dangerous for conventional rescue aircraft. Captain Chun, Major Rodriguez said as he presented her certificate, "You've demonstrated exceptional capabilities throughout this training program. Your assignment reflects the military's confidence in your ability to succeed where others might fail." The formal language carried, meaning that everyone present understood. Sarah was being entrusted with missions that would test everything she'd learned and potentially require her to exceed even those capabilities. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by family members who'd traveled to witness her graduation, fellow graduates who wanted to maintain professional relationships, and military officials whose interest in her future was both professional and political. The attention was overwhelming for someone who'd spent 2 years trying to remain invisible at a small desert airport. Frank Morrison had made the trip from Henderson Municipal, his presence a reminder of the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Proud of you, Sarah," he said simply. "You've accomplished something that nobody thought was possible." His words carried more weight than formal congratulations, because they came from someone who'd believed in her capabilities when others had dismissed them. Captain Torres, who'd become both a friend and rival throughout training, approached with the kind of respect that military aviators reserved for peers they trusted completely. "Chun, I hope we get the chance to fly together again. You've got instincts that can't be taught and judgment that comes from somewhere most of us haven't been." The compliment meant more than official recognition because it reflected professional assessment from someone qualified to make it. That evening, alone in her temporary quarters, Sarah reviewed the orders that would determine her immediate future. The assignment was to a unit that officially didn't exist, conducting missions that weren't acknowledged in public records, operating aircraft that combined cutting-edge technology with capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what military aviation could accomplish. The rejection letter that had started this journey felt like ancient history now, a document from a time when her worth was determined by policy rather than performance. Tomorrow she would begin missions that required everything she'd learned, and more, flying in situations where success meant lives saved and failure meant consequences that extended far beyond personal disappointment. Sarah had spent 6 months proving that exceptional flying transcended traditional barriers. Now she would have the opportunity to demonstrate that truth in situations where the stakes were measured in human lives rather than training scores. The first woman qualified for combat search and rescue was about to discover whether breaking barriers was the beginning of her story or its defining achievement. The classified briefing room at Creech Air Force Base contained maps that showed regions where conventional military operations weren't officially conducted. Sarah Chun sat among 8 other combat rescue specialists, studying satellite imagery of terrain that appeared on no public charts, listening to intelligence assessments that would never appear in official reports. This was her first operational assignment since graduating from Combat Search and Rescue School, and the stakes were exactly what she'd prepared for without fully understanding. Colonel Marcus Webb commanded the 58th Special Operations Wing, a unit that existed in the shadows between acknowledged military activity and operations that required plausible deniability. His briefing style was precise and comprehensive, designed to provide maximum information while maintaining operational security that protected both missions and personnel. Sarah had learned that his reputation included successful operations in environments that challenged the most experienced special operations forces. "Gentlemen and Captain Chun," Colonel Webb began, His inclusion of her gender, a reminder that her presence represented a significant departure from historical precedent. We have a situation developing in the Hindu Kush Mountains along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. A joint CIA Special Forces reconnaissance team has been compromised during intelligence gathering operations. Standard extraction protocols are not viable due to terrain and enemy activity. The satellite images displayed terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain pilots. Peaks rising above 20,000 feet, valleys that created unpredictable wind patterns, weather conditions that could change from clear visibility to whiteout conditions within minutes. The compromised location was accessible only through approaches that would expose rescue aircraft to enemy fire for extended periods. The team consists of 6 personnel, including a AI operative carrying intelligence that cannot be allowed to fall into hostile hands, Colonel Webb continued. Their current position is defensible for approximately 72 hours, after which overwhelming enemy forces will make extraction impossible. Weather windows suitable for helicopter operations are limited and becoming increasingly rare as winter conditions develop. Sarah studied the intelligence package with professional interest and growing recognition of the challenges involved. The extraction point was located in a valley that could only be accessed through narrow passes, each controlled by enemy forces with sophisticated anti-aircraft capabilities. The timeline allowed for only one attempt, making mission planning critical and execution absolutely precise. Captain Chun, Colonel Webb said, addressing her directly, your demonstrated expertise in high-altitude operations and precision, flying in confined spaces makes you the primary pilot for this mission. You'll be flying our most advanced rescue helicopter, equipped with systems that push the boundaries of current technology. The assignment carried implications that Sarah understood completely. Success would validate her presence in combat rescue operations. Failure would provide ammunition for those who questioned women's capabilities in these roles. The MH-6OM Black Hawk variant, assigned to her mission, represented the pinnacle of military helicopter technology. Advanced navigation systems, defensive countermeasures, and engine modifications that provided performance at altitudes where conventional aircraft struggled to maintain power. But technology was only as effective as the pilot who operated it, and the mission would require capabilities that exceeded even advanced training. Master Sergeant Jake Thompson would serve as her flight engineer, a veteran of dozens of special operations missions whose expertise included both technical systems and tactical assessment. His initial reaction to working with the first female combat rescue pilot was professionally neutral, but Sarah recognized the careful evaluation that experienced special operations personnel applied to new team members. Ma'am, I've reviewed your training records and the mission parameters, Thompson said during their initial planning session. This extraction will require flying at the absolute limits of aircraft performance in conditions that provide no margin for error. Are you comfortable operating in that environment? The question was fair and necessary, reflecting legitimate concerns about capabilities rather than gender-based assumptions. Sergeant, I've been operating aircraft at their performance limits since before I joined this program, Sarah replied honestly. The difference is that now I'm doing it with better equipment and support. Her response reflected confidence based on experience rather than bravado, acknowledging the challenges while asserting her readiness to meet them. The mission planning phase consumed 18 hours of intensive preparation. Route analysis, weather assessment, enemy capability evaluation, contingency planning for scenarios that intelligence couldn't predict with certainty. Sarah found herself working with specialists whose expertise encompassed areas she'd never encountered, learning about enemy tactics, terrain analysis, and operational security that extended far beyond flight planning. Captain Michael Stevens, the mission commander, brought special operations experience that complemented her aviation expertise. His role involved coordinating between the rescue team and ground forces while managing tactical decisions that affected mission success. Their planning discussions revealed different perspectives on risk assessment and decision-making priorities. The primary concern is minimizing exposure time in the target area, Stevens explained during route planning. Every minute we spend in that valley increases the probability of enemy engagement and mission compromise. His approach prioritized speed and efficiency, accepting increased risk during approach and departure phases to reduce vulnerability during extraction operations. Sarah understood his reasoning but had learned to consider factors that pure tactical thinking sometimes overlooked. Captain, weather conditions in mountain environments can change faster than tactical situations. We need contingency plans that don't assume perfect conditions throughout mission execution. Her perspective reflected lessons learned from flying in environments where adaptation was often more important than aggressive execution. The compromise they developed balanced tactical efficiency with operational flexibility, primary routes that maximized speed and surprise, alternate approaches that accounted for weather deterioration or enemy activity, contingency plans that provided options when initial strategies proved inadequate. The planning reflected both of their expertise while acknowledging that successful missions often required improvisation despite comprehensive preparation. 2 days before mission execution, Sarah received a visit from General Patricia Martinez, whose presence at Creech Air Force Base suggested that this operation carried significance beyond routine special operations missions. Their conversation was conducted privately, but its implications extended far beyond personal encouragement or operational oversight. Captain Chun, this mission represents more than a rescue operation, General Martinez said without preamble. Your performance will be evaluated by officials whose decisions affect military policy regarding women in combat roles. Success will open doors that have been closed for decades. Failure will provide evidence for those who oppose expanded opportunities. The statement was blunt but necessary, acknowledging political realities that Sarah couldn't ignore. General, I understand the broader implications, Sarah replied carefully. But the mission has to be my primary focus. The people we're extracting deserve my complete attention rather than concern about policy debates. Her response reflected genuine priorities, while acknowledging that exceptional performance would serve multiple purposes simultaneously. That's exactly the attitude that makes you the right pilot for this mission, General Martinez replied with approval. Focus on bringing those people home safely. Everything else will follow from mission success. The conversation ended with mutual understanding that Sarah's assignment carried responsibilities that extended beyond individual achievement to institutional change. The night before mission execution, Sarah conducted her final aircraft inspection. With attention to detail that exceeded normal pre-flight procedures, the modified Black Hawk represented capabilities she dreamed of utilizing during her years at Henderson Municipal, systems that could provide performance advantages in exactly the kind of challenging environment she was about to enter. The defensive countermeasures included jamming equipment that could confuse enemy radar and missile systems, shaft dispensers that provided protection against heat-seeking weapons, and armor that could withstand small arms fire without compromising flight characteristics. But Sarah understood that technology was supplement to rather than substitute for exceptional flying skills. Master Sergeant Thompson joined her for the inspection, his experienced eyes checking systems that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Ma'am, this aircraft is as ready as we can make it," he reported after completing his technical assessment. Performance parameters are optimized for high-altitude operations, defensive systems are fully operational, and navigation equipment is calibrated for the terrain we'll be operating in. "Thank you, Sergeant," Sarah replied, completing her own assessment of flight controls and engine systems. Tomorrow we'll find out whether our preparation was adequate for what we're actually going to encounter. The statement reflected realistic understanding that missions rarely unfolded exactly as planned, regardless of preparation quality. Mission launch occurred at 0400 hours, during the narrow window when darkness provided concealment while dawn's approach would facilitate extraction operations. Sarah lifted off into night, sky that was clear but would become increasingly challenging as they approached their operational area. The flight to the extraction zone would take 4 hours, crossing terrain that became progressively more hostile and technically demanding. The initial phase of the mission proceeded according to plan. Navigation waypoints were reached on schedule. Aircraft performance remained within optimal parameters, and weather conditions matched intelligence predictions. Sarah found herself settling into the focused mental state that complex flying required, where conscious thought yielded to trained responses and intuitive decision-making. Approaching first checkpoint, Master Sergeant Thompson reported as they crossed into airspace where enemy detection became a significant concern. Defensive systems are active, navigation is on track, and all aircraft systems are performing normally. His updates provided essential information while maintaining the minimal communication that operational security required. The terrain below began revealing the challenges that intelligence assessments had described, but couldn't fully convey. Peaks that rose abruptly from valley floors, passes that appeared navigable from satellite imagery but proved barely wide enough for helicopter passage, wind patterns that created turbulence, requiring constant control adjustments. Sarah found herself grateful for years of flying in difficult conditions that had prepared her for exactly this kind of environment. Contact, possible enemy radar activation, came the report from Captain Stevens, who was monitoring electronic intelligence from the passenger compartment. Bearing 270, approximately 15 miles. Recommend course adjustment to maintain concealment. The development wasn't unexpected, but it required immediate tactical decision-making that could affect mission timeline and approach options. Sarah adjusted course without hesitation, following pre-planned evasion routes that would maintain concealment while adding time to their flight plan. The modification was minor but significant, demonstrating the kind of real-time adaptation that separated successful missions from theoretical planning. Her response reflected training that had emphasized flexibility over rigid adherence to predetermined courses. As they approached the target area, weather conditions began deteriorating exactly as Sarah had anticipated during mission planning. Cloud formations that hadn't appeared on meteorological predictions started building over mountain peaks, creating visibility challenges that would complicate both approach and departure operations. The development validated her insistence on contingency planning during the preparation phase. Weather deterioration ahead, she reported to the mission command. Visibility is dropping, and cloud formations are developing that could affect extraction operations. Recommend expedited timeline for ground team preparation. The assessment was professional and accurate, reflecting judgment that prioritized mission success over adherence to original timing. The extraction point appeared exactly as satellite imagery had indicated, but operational realities proved more complex than planning had anticipated. The valley was narrower than photographs had suggested. Wind patterns were more turbulent than modeling had predicted, and defensive positions were more extensive than intelligence had identified. Sarah found herself facing the kind of situation that required everything her training had provided plus capabilities that only experience could develop. Ground team in sight, Master Sergeant Thompson reported as they approached the landing zone. 6 personnel ready for extraction, but enemy activity is increasing. Recommend minimum time on ground. His assessment reflected tactical awareness that complemented Sarah's aviation expertise, providing information that affected both flying decisions and mission execution. Sarah began her approach to the confined landing zone with precision that drew upon every hour of mountain flying experience. she'd accumulated. The space was barely adequate for helicopter operations, surrounded by terrain that eliminated second chances if initial approach attempts failed. Wind conditions required constant control adjustments, while enemy activity demanded speed that couldn't compromise safety. The landing was executed with mechanical precision, placing the aircraft exactly where ground personnel could board quickly while maintaining power settings that permitted immediate departure if enemy contact intensified. Sarah held the helicopter in a hover that required absolute concentration, reading aircraft responses while monitoring tactical situations that could change instantly. "Loading complete," Captain Stevens reported as the last rescued personnel boarded the aircraft. 6 individuals aboard, all mobile, ready for immediate departure. The efficiency of the extraction reflected professional competence from all involved, but Sarah understood that departure would prove more challenging than approach had been. Enemy forces had used their extraction time to improve defensive positions and coordinate response to the rescue operation. Anti-aircraft fire began erupting around their position as Sarah initiated departure, requiring evasive maneuvers that tested both aircraft capabilities and pilot skills simultaneously. The Black Hawk responded to her inputs with precision that allowed navigation through hostile fire while maintaining the performance necessary for escape. Taking fire from multiple positions, Master Sergeant Thompson reported, monitoring defensive systems that were automatically deploying countermeasures against incoming threats. Chaff dispensed, jamming active, recommend maximum performance climb to clear engagement zone. His updates provided essential information while Sarah focused on flying that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. The departure route led through a narrow pass that was complicated by weather conditions and enemy fire simultaneously. Sarah found herself flying approaches that exceeded anything attempted during training, using aircraft performance that pushed beyond conservative operating parameters, while maintaining the precision necessary for navigation through confined spaces. The flying required every skill she developed throughout her aviation career. "Contact, shoulder-fired missile launch," came the urgent report from Captain Stevens, whose tactical monitoring had identified the most serious threat they'd yet encountered. Bearing 0-9-0, climbing toward our position. The development required immediate evasive action that couldn't compromise their navigation through terrain that offered no margin for error. Sarah initiated defensive maneuvers that combined electronic countermeasures with aircraft maneuvering, deploying chaff while executing turns that exceeded normal performance parameters. The Black Hawk responded with the kind of precision that validated her confidence in its capabilities, providing performance that allowed survival in situations where lesser aircraft would have been vulnerable. The missile passed harmlessly by their position, defeated by combination of electronic jamming and evasive maneuvering that demonstrated both technological superiority and exceptional piloting skills. But the engagement had consumed time and fuel while exposing them to additional threats that could compromise their extraction from hostile territory. "Clear of immediate engagement zone," Master Sergeant Thompson reported as they gained altitude and distance from enemy positions. Aircraft systems normal, fuel consumption within acceptable parameters, navigation on track for extraction route. His assessment provided welcome confirmation that their aircraft remained capable of completing the mission despite combat stress. The flight home proceeded through increasingly challenging weather conditions that validated Sarah's contingency. Planning during mission preparation. Cloud formations that had been developing during their approach to the target area had intensified, creating visibility challenges that required instrument flying in terrain where electronic navigation was supplemented by visual references that appeared and disappeared unpredictably. Approaching weather front, Sarah reported to Mission Control as they encountered conditions that pushed the boundaries of safe helicopter operations. Visibility decreasing, turbulence increasing. Recommend priority handling for approach. Landing. The request reflected professional assessment of conditions that required expedited clearance to avoid prolonged exposure to dangerous weather. The approach to Creech Air Force Base was conducted under conditions that would have challenged experienced pilots flying familiar aircraft in known terrain. Sarah navigated through weather that reduced visibility to minimum acceptable levels, while managing aircraft that had been stressed by combat operations and high-performance flying. The landing was executed with precision that reflected capabilities developed through years of challenging flying experiences. Mission complete, she reported to the control tower as the rescued personnel disembarked and aircraft systems were secured. 6 individuals extracted successfully, aircraft condition nominal, no crew injuries. The formal language captured mission success, but couldn't convey the personal satisfaction of completing an operation that had tested everything she'd learned about aviation and proven that her capabilities matched the most demanding requirements. The mission debrief was conducted with thoroughness that reflected both operational requirements and institutional interest in analyzing performance that had broader implications. Colonel Webb led the session with participation from officials, whose presence indicated that this operation was being evaluated beyond normal post-mission analysis procedures. Outstanding performance throughout all phases of the mission, Colonel Webb concluded after reviewing timeline tactical decisions and aircraft handling that had contributed to successful extraction. Captain Chun's flying exceeded requirements while adapting to conditions that challenged even optimistic planning assumptions. The rescued personnel are alive because of exceptional aviation skills applied under combat conditions. General Martinez attended the debrief conclusion, her presence confirming that Sarah's performance was being evaluated for its implications regarding women's roles in combat operations. Captain Chun, this mission demonstrates conclusively that exceptional piloting transcends traditional barriers. You've proven that combat rescue operations require capabilities that are determined by skill and judgment rather than gender. The statement carried significance that extended beyond personal recognition to institutional policy. Sarah had succeeded in exactly the kind of high-stakes mission that critics had argued women couldn't handle, demonstrating performance that exceeded many male colleagues while operating under conditions that challenged the most experienced combat pilots. 3 months after the successful extraction mission, Sarah found herself assigned to a new role that reflected both her proven capabilities and the military's recognition that exceptional performance created opportunities for expanded responsibilities. She became the chief instructor for advanced combat rescue techniques, responsible for training pilots whose missions would require exactly the kind of skills she demonstrated in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The assignment represented more than career advancement. Sarah was being entrusted with developing the next generation of combat rescue pilots, sharing knowledge that had been earned through trials that most aviators would never face. Her classroom at the Combat Search and Rescue School was equipped with simulation technology that could replicate the conditions she'd encountered during actual missions. Combat rescue flying isn't about following procedures, Sarah told her first class of advanced students, all experienced pilots, who'd volunteered for training that would qualify them for the military's most challenging missions. It's about making decisions when procedures prove inadequate and adapting to conditions that weren't covered in your training manuals. The students included both male and female pilots, reflecting institutional changes that Sarah's success had helped accelerate. Her presence as an instructor legitimized opportunities that had previously been theoretical, providing proof that exceptional performance was achievable regardless of gender when preparation met opportunity under the right circumstances. Master Sergeant Thompson had requested assignment as her senior instructor, bringing experience that complemented her aviation expertise with tactical knowledge that enhanced student preparation. Their partnership reflected professional respect that had developed through shared experience in situations where competence was measured by results rather than assumptions. "Ma'am, these students are getting training that I wish had been available when I started special operations," Thompson observed during a break between instruction sessions. "Your approach to teaching decision-making under pressure is producing pilots who think differently about problem-solving in challenging environments." His assessment reflected recognition that teaching exceptional performance required different methods than standard military instruction. The training curriculum Sarah developed emphasized adaptive decision-making over procedural compliance, realistic scenario practice over theoretical knowledge, and the kind of judgment that could only be developed through experience with situations where margins for error were minimal. Her methods reflected lessons learned through years of flying that had challenged conventional approaches to aviation. 6 months into her instructor assignment, Sarah received recognition that validated both her individual achievement and its broader significance. The Distinguished Flying Cross for the Hindu Kush extraction mission, presented during a ceremony that acknowledged her role in proving that combat rescue capabilities transcended traditional gender limitations. Captain Chun's extraordinary achievement opens doors for future generations of aviators, General Martinez stated during the presentation ceremony. Her demonstrated expertise under combat conditions establishes new standards for what's possible when exceptional preparation meets challenging circumstances. The recognition represented institutional acknowledgement that Sarah's success had implications extending far beyond individual accomplishment. The ceremony was attended by officials whose presence reflected the operation's significance in military aviation history. Sarah had become not just a successful combat rescue pilot, but a symbol of changing institutional attitudes toward women's capabilities in roles that had previously been restricted by policy rather than performance requirements. But for Sarah, the most meaningful recognition came from sources that reflected professional rather than political validation. Letters from pilots she'd trained who'd successfully completed their own challenging missions, acknowledgement from special operations personnel who'd worked with her during subsequent operations, and requests from international military organizations interested in learning from her instructional methods. Frank Morrison attended the ceremony, his presence a reminder of the journey that had begun at Henderson Municipal Airport when a routine cargo flight had led to her first rescue mission. "Proud of you, Sarah," he said simply. "You've accomplished something that changes what's possible for everyone who comes after you." His words carried weight because they came from someone who'd recognized her potential before others had been willing to acknowledge it. 2 years after graduating from Combat Search and Rescue School, Sarah found herself facing opportunities that validated every challenge she'd overcome to reach this point. Assignment offers from units conducting missions she couldn't have imagined during her time flying crop dusters, consultation requests from aviation organizations seeking expertise in training exceptional pilots, and academic opportunities to research and develop advanced techniques for operating in challenging environments. The rejection letter that had started her journey felt like ancient history now, a document from a time when artificial barriers had obscured natural capabilities. Sarah had proven that exceptional flying ability transcended conventional limitations, that combat rescue missions required skills that could be developed by anyone willing to pursue excellence, regardless of institutional assumptions about who belonged in challenging roles. Her small apartment near the Combat Search and Rescue School displayed awards and recognitions that documented a career trajectory few aviators achieved. But the items that meant most to her were letters from students who'd applied her teaching to successful missions of their own. Each represented validation that her knowledge and experience were serving purposes larger than individual achievement. The photograph on her desk showed the crew of her Hindu Kush extraction mission, all of them wearing expressions that reflected professional satisfaction with exceptional performance under challenging conditions. Master Sergeant Thompson had written on the back, "To the best pilot I've flown with, regardless of gender, regardless of circumstances, regardless of anything except results that speak for themselves. Sarah Chun had transformed from a rejected applicant into the first woman to fly combat rescue missions, proving that barriers existed primarily in institutional thinking rather than operational reality. Her success had opened doors for others, while establishing new standards for what exceptional performance looked like when preparation met opportunity, under conditions that tested every capability. But her greatest satisfaction came from knowing that her students were carrying forward knowledge that could save lives in situations where conventional approaches proved inadequate. She'd learned that breaking barriers was just the beginning of a story that continued through every pilot who benefited from expanded opportunities and elevated standards. The small desert airport, where she'd spent 2 years developing skills in obscurity, remained a reminder that extraordinary capabilities often developed in unexpected places, waiting for circumstances that would reveal their true value. Sarah had learned that recognition mattered less than contribution, that individual achievement meant most when it served something larger than personal advancement. As she prepared for her next assignment, leading an international training program that would share combat rescue techniques with allied military forces, Sarah reflected on a journey that had exceeded every expectation she'd held when her initial application was rejected. She'd proven that exceptional performance transcended traditional limitations, that combat flying required capabilities that could be developed by anyone committed to pursuing excellence. The first woman to fly combat rescue missions had become something more significant than a pioneering aviator. She'd become proof that institutional barriers existed primarily in thinking rather than operational reality, that exceptional standards created opportunities for everyone willing to meet them regardless of background or gender. Her story continued through every pilot who benefited from expanded opportunities, every successful mission that drew upon techniques she'd developed and shared, every student who learned that exceptional performance was achievable when preparation met dedication under circumstances that demanded nothing less than the very best. 5 years had passed since Sarah Chun became the first woman to complete combat search and rescue operations, and the landscape of military aviation had shifted in ways that even optimistic projections hadn't anticipated. Her office at the newly established International Combat Rescue Training Center overlooked runways where helicopters from 12 different nations conducted exercises that would have been impossible before institutional barriers began falling. The training center represented evolution in military thinking that extended far beyond gender integration. Sarah's proven methods for developing exceptional pilots had attracted attention from allied forces seeking to elevate their own rescue capabilities, creating opportunities for knowledge sharing that transcended national boundaries and traditional approaches to aviation instruction. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, one of Sarah's former students, had recently returned from a successful extraction mission in the mountains of Eastern Europe, where her training had proven decisive in bringing home a downed NATO pilot. Her after-action report specifically credited decision-making techniques learned in Sarah's advanced instruction program, validation that teaching methods developed through combat experience were producing results in real-world operations. "Ma'am, the techniques you taught us about reading terrain and weather patterns simultaneously saved the mission," Rodriguez reported during her debrief. "When our primary approach became impossible due to unexpected wind conditions, I was able to adapt using methods that aren't covered in standard training curricula." The success reflected institutional investment in developing pilots who could think beyond procedural compliance. Sarah had learned that her greatest contribution might not be her own flying achievements, but rather the multiplication of capabilities through students who carried forward knowledge that had been earned through trials most aviators would never face. Each successful mission they completed represented validation that exceptional performance could be systematically developed rather than accidentally discovered. The international training program attracted participants whose backgrounds reflected changing attitudes toward combat aviation. Female pilots from air forces that had recently opened combat roles, experienced male aviators seeking advanced techniques for challenging missions, and special operations personnel who needed to understand helicopter capabilities for planning purposes. Major Ahmed Hassan from the Egyptian Air Force had initially expressed skepticism about learning from a female instructor, but his attitude changed completely after observing Sarah's approach to teaching complex decision-making under pressure. Captain Chun's methods produce pilots who think differently about problem-solving. He acknowledged during a training evaluation, gender becomes irrelevant when results speak for themselves. The transformation in Hassan's perspective reflected broader changes in military culture that Sarah's success had helped accelerate. Performance-based evaluation was gradually replacing assumption-based limitations, creating opportunities for advancement that were determined by capability rather than traditional expectations about who belonged in challenging roles. Sarah's teaching methodology emphasized simulation of conditions that couldn't be safely practiced in actual aircraft, using technology that replicated the stress and complexity of combat rescue operations without exposing students to unnecessary risk. The simulators could reproduce the Hindu Kush extraction mission with accuracy that allowed students to experience decision-making challenges that had shaped her own development. The key to exceptional performance, Sarah explained to her current class during a particularly intensive training session, is preparation for conditions that exceed your previous experience. You can't wait until you're facing a real emergency to discover whether your judgment is adequate for situations that demand immediate, correct decisions. Her instruction reflected understanding that exceptional flying required mental preparation that extended beyond technical proficiency. The students responded to her teaching with attention that reflected recognition of expertise that couldn't be questioned or dismissed. They understood that her methods had been proven under conditions where failure meant consequences that extended far beyond training scores, that her knowledge represented survival techniques rather than theoretical concepts. Frank Morrison visited the training center periodically, his presence a reminder of the small desert airport where Sarah's capabilities had remained hidden until circumstances revealed their true value. His conversations with international students provided perspective on the journey that had brought her from crop dusting to developing the world's most advanced combat rescue training program. She was always exceptional, Frank told a group of visiting military officials during one of his trips. The difference now is that institutions have learned to recognize and utilize exceptional performance instead of limiting it through policies that had nothing to do with operational effectiveness. His observation reflected broader recognition that artificial barriers had constrained military effectiveness unnecessarily. Sarah's reputation had attracted attention from civilian aviation organizations seeking to improve their own emergency response capabilities. Medical helicopter services, search and rescue operations, and disaster response teams had begun implementing training methods she'd developed for military applications, adapting combat rescue techniques for humanitarian missions. The crossover between military and civilian applications validated her belief that exceptional flying techniques serve universal purposes, that skills developed for combat rescue operations could save lives in any environment where aircraft were required to perform beyond normal limitations. Her knowledge was proving valuable wherever precision flying met challenging conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Wells, Sarah's former classmate from Combat Search and Rescue School, had recently been promoted to command a rescue squadron that included both male and female pilots. Her leadership reflected institutional changes that Sarah's success had helped legitimize, proving that combat rescue required leadership qualities that transcended traditional gender expectations. Sarah's achievement opened doors that allowed the rest of us to prove our own capabilities. Wells acknowledged during a conference on women in military aviation. But more importantly, her teaching methods are producing better pilots regardless of gender, elevating standards for everyone involved in combat rescue operations. The assessment reflected recognition that individual achievement had served. Broader institutional improvement. The Training Center's research division had begun documenting and analyzing techniques that Sarah had developed through necessity during her years of flying in challenging conditions. Her approaches to decision-making under pressure, adaptation to changing circumstances, and precision flying in confined spaces were being studied for applications that extended beyond rescue operations. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former military pilot, who'd transitioned to aviation psychology research, collaborated with Sarah on developing training protocols that could systematically develop judgment and adaptability, rather than leaving these crucial capabilities to chance development through experience. Their work was attracting attention from aviation organizations worldwide. Captain Chun's methods produce pilots who demonstrate superior performance across multiple evaluation criteria, Dr. Vasquez explained during a presentation to military leadership. Her approach to training decision-making under stress is achieving results that traditional instruction methods haven't matched. The research provided scientific validation for techniques that Sarah had developed through practical necessity. General Martinez, now serving as Director of Military Personnel Policy, had used Sarah's success as a foundation for comprehensive review of restrictions that had limited opportunities for qualified personnel. Her policy recommendations reflected understanding that institutional effectiveness required utilizing all available talent rather than limiting it through assumptions about capability. Captain Chun's achievement demonstrated that combat effectiveness depends on individual capability rather than demographic characteristics, General Martinez stated during congressional testimony about military personnel policies. Expanding opportunities for qualified personnel, regardless of gender, serves national security interests by ensuring that our most challenging missions are conducted by our most capable people. The testimony reflected institutional learning that extended far beyond individual achievement. Sarah's influence on military aviation extended to international partnerships, where her training methods were being adapted for allied forces facing similar operational challenges. NATO exercises now included scenarios based on missions she'd conducted, and her techniques were being incorporated into standardized training curricula that would influence combat rescue operations for decades. The Afghan extraction mission that had tested her capabilities under combat conditions had become a case study taught in military academies worldwide, not because of its individual significance, but because it demonstrated decision-making principles that applied to any situation where success required exceeding normal performance parameters. Young aviators entering military service could now pursue career paths that hadn't existed when Sarah was facing rejection from flight training programs. Her success had legitimized opportunities while establishing standards that emphasized capability over demographics, creating advancement routes that attracted the most qualified candidates regardless of background. Master Sergeant Thompson, now serving as the Training Center's senior instructor, reflected on changes he'd witnessed throughout his career. 20 years ago, we were limiting our effectiveness by restricting opportunities for qualified people, he observed. Now we're focused on developing the best possible pilots and leaders, which serves everyone's interests better. His perspective reflected institutional evolution that valued results over tradition. Sarah's story had become more than individual achievement. It represented proof that exceptional performance could overcome institutional barriers while serving purposes that transcended personal advancement. Her success had demonstrated that military effectiveness improved when opportunities were determined by capability rather than assumption, that breaking barriers served national security interests by ensuring that challenging missions were assigned to the most qualified personnel available. The small apartment where she'd once contemplated the rejection letter that started her journey now served as a reminder that exceptional capabilities often developed in unexpected circumstances, waiting for opportunities to serve purposes larger than individual ambition. Sarah had learned that pioneering achievement was most meaningful when it created possibilities for others, that breaking barriers was just the beginning of stories that continued through everyone who benefited from expanded opportunities and elevated standards. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.